My name is Holly Rivera. I was 30 years old, and halfway through passing the salad at Sunday dinner in my parents' house in Cincinnati, when my dad casually announced that my older sister Sonia would be moving into my place. He said it the way someone might mention the weather, like, "Looks like rain tomorrow only." This was my home, my mortgage, my life. He was rearranging over a bowl of romaine. My mom nodded along, smiling at Sonia at the other end of the table, while Sonia swirled her wine like a guest of honor who had just been handed a prize. Before I tell you how I answered them, and how that dinner ended with my entire family staring at me like I'd set the table on fire, let me ask you something. If your parents decided your home was family property because you were doing okay, would you let them? Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and what you would have done if you were in my chair. My mom had gone all out for that dinner, which was my first clue. Something was off even before my dad opened his mouth. The good dishes were out, the roast smelled like every childhood Sunday, and there was a chilled bottle of champagne sweating on the sideboard that nobody had explained yet. My dad carved the meat, then cleared his throat and looked at me over the carving knife. "With how big your house is, mija, it just makes sense," he said, launching into a speech about family sticking together, sharing blessings, and helping your sister through a rough patch. My mom chimed in with lines about how my renovated row house in Over the Rhine must feel awfully empty with just me and my laptop in it. Sonia sat there in a silk blouse I knew she hadn't bought herself, grinning like she was the guest on a talk show waiting for applause. Watching her soak in their admiration, I realized this dinner wasn't a conversation. It was a presentation, and I was supposed to clap on cue. Growing up, that dynamic wasn't new. Sonia was 3 years older than me and had always been the sun my parents orbited. When we were kids on the west side of Cincinnati, I earned allowance by mopping floors and babysitting neighbors' kids, while Sonia could whine in the cereal aisle and somehow walk out with the sugary brand my mom had just said they couldn't afford. If I wanted new sneakers, my dad told me to save up. If Sonia wanted concert tickets, my mom talked about letting her enjoy being young and found the money. When high school came, I was the one expected to keep straight A's and come straight home, while Sonia could miss curfew and still get a gentle lecture and a plate of reheated dinner. Everyone in our family joked that I was the responsible one and Sonia was the free spirit, but the joke never landed for me the way it did for them. The pattern only deepened when college hit. Sonia announced she wanted to try out a private university in another state, and my parents scraped together savings and took out loans to give her a completely covered first year, calling it her big chance. By the end of that year, she was on academic probation, claiming the professors didn't get her creativity, and after a second bad semester, she came home blaming the school, the dorms, and the food. When it was my turn, I was told there was nothing left. I went to the state school across the river, worked nights at a diner, and took out loans I still felt on my shoulders years later. When I pulled honor roll grades, my parents nodded and said, "We knew you'd be fine." When Sonia took a temp job and quit it 2 weeks later because the vibe was off, my parents took her out to dinner to comfort her. After graduation, I fell into real estate almost by accident, starting as a receptionist in a downtown Cincinnati brokerage. I watched agents tour condos in Over the Rhine and Hyde Park with clients who talked about exposed brick and walkability, and something in me clicked. I studied for my license at night, passed on the first try, and slowly clawed my way into a junior agent role. My life for years was open houses, cold calls, and cheap takeout in tiny rentals, the kind with crooked cabinets and paper-thin walls. Sonia, meanwhile, treated jobs like outfits. She tried being a bartender and got let go after giving away drinks. She worked for a local boutique and was mysteriously fired after inventory didn't add up. She joined a marketing startup and quit because they didn't respect her vision. Each failure came with a long story about bad bosses and jealous coworkers, never once about her own choices, and my parents listened like it was all happening to her, never caused by her. Buying my own place felt like my private rebellion against that script. I spent 8 years in one-bedrooms and studio walk-ups, stuffing every extra commission into savings while Sonia still lived paycheck to paycheck with my parents, covering her overdraft fees. Then, a skinny century-old brick row house in Over the Rhine hit the market 2 bedrooms tall windows original staircase, but recently updated kitchen and baths. It wasn't a dream mansion. It was narrow and old and layered with Cincinnati history. And as soon as I walked through, I saw my life unfolding there. I stretched my budget, negotiated like my career depended on it, and cried in my car the day I signed the closing papers. At my housewarming, my dad stood in my small backyard grilling brats. My mom fussed with pillows on the thrifted couch, and for a few hours they looked at me the way they usually looked at Sonia. Sonia arrived late, breezed past my congratulatory hug, and when she finally commented on the house, it was cute. This would be a great place for me to throw a party sometime. For 2 years, I poured myself into that row house. I painted the living room a soft green sanded and stained the wood floors by hand and planted herbs in a narrow strip of soil by the back fence. On Sunday mornings, I'd sit by the front window with coffee, watching people walk dogs and head to brunch, feeling like I had finally built something that was mine. But old houses have secrets, and mine started to show them. First, the furnace died in January, forcing me to pay several $1,000s I hadn't planned on. Then a roofer found serious issues, and there went a chunk of my savings. When the kitchen sink began leaking, I thought it was a minor annoyance until Julio Campos, the plumber my inspector had once recommended, crouched under my sink, frowned, and told me the main line out toward the street was corroding. The estimate he gave me to fix it properly was just under $10,000. My emergency fund, already battered, simply wasn't enough. For the first time since buying, I felt like the house owned me instead of the other way around. I pulled every statement and spreadsheet and booked a meeting with my financial advisor, Bianca Morales, who had helped me plan the initial purchase. Sitting in her office overlooking downtown, we went line by line through my mortgage, my commissions, my student loans, and those mounting repair bills. "You're not drowning yet," Bianca said gently, "but you are treading water in heavy boots." She laid out 2 paths. One, refinance, take on more debt, pray nothing else broke. 2, sell while the market in Over the Rhine was still hot, pay off the mortgage, kill the high-interest debt, and reset with something smaller and newer. At first, it felt like failure to even consider selling. That row house wasn't just a building, it was proof I wasn't the kid who would be fine no matter what. But as Bianca walked me through the math, I couldn't deny the reality. Having a pretty house and constant anxiety was not the life I had imagined. I went back to the brokerage and asked my colleague Jade Harper to come over and give me a brutally honest opinion. Jade specialized in city homes and had a reputation for pricing things exactly right. She walked every inch of the place, poked at windows, glanced at my repair receipts, and finally said, "If we list this right now, I could probably get you multiple offers. There's a couple the Kings who just lost a bidding war on a similar place closer to downtown. They're pre-approved and still looking." The idea of strangers in my living room felt surreal, but the thought of sleeping without calculating bills in my head was magnetic. Within a week, Jade had photos taken and the listing live. Elliot and Dana King toured my house while I was at work. By that evening, they'd offered above asking with one major condition: they wanted to close quickly in about 30 days, with me renting back for another month at a small fee while I found a new place. My chest hurt signing the paperwork, but when I walked out holding the timeline to my financial freedom, a different kind of relief settled over me. I hadn't told my parents about any of it yet. Partly because I wanted the deal to clear inspection first, partly because I wanted this decision to be mine alone. That's when the weird calls started. My mom, who usually phoned me once a week on Sunday, started calling on random weeknights just to check in, and then steering the conversation toward how big an older home can be for one person, and how nice it is when sisters are close. My dad phoned to ask about the neighborhood vibe at night and whether I ever felt scared walking home alone, which he'd never worried about before. Sonia, who had barely texted me in months, suddenly wanted to know my Wi-Fi speed, which bedroom got the best natural light, and whether my neighbors minded music. When I asked why, she replied with a winky emoji and a just curious. At the same time, my mom casually mentioned that Sonia's landlord, a guy named Ralph Turner, was being totally unfair about noise complaints and late rent. I should have connected the dots earlier, but between client showings and lining up my own new lease, I let it all slide into the background. By the time the inspection finished smoothly and the Kings removed contingencies, the closing was scheduled for Friday, 2 days before the Sunday dinner. My mom insisted we absolutely shouldn't miss. I told myself I'd mention the sale once the check was in my hand, but then my mom said she was making something special, and my dad joked about toasting to big family changes, and I felt a prickle of unease. That night, I walked through my half-packed living room and tried to imagine how they'd react if I told them I was selling. Part of me feared they'd be disappointed. A bigger part, though, I didn't want to admit it, yet feared they'd treat the proceeds like a communal fund. When Friday came, I signed the closing documents, handed the Kings the keys, and walked out with my equity sitting in a cashier's check and a signed agreement to rent back for 1 more month. I sat in my parked car for 10 minutes just breathing. Then I drove to my soon-to-be former row house, taped a few more boxes, and told myself I could handle whatever Sunday brought. Sunday brought the good china, the champagne, and that line about Sonia moving into my house. After my dad's opening, Sonia launched into the prepared part. She stood up, tapped her glass with a fork, and smiled like we were at an engagement party. "So big news," she said. "Ralph's being impossible about my lease and the job market is brutal right now, but I'm staying positive. Mom and Dad and I have been brainstorming, and we realized it's silly for me to keep paying some stranger when my own sister has a whole extra bedroom." My mom beamed. My dad nodded along. "Starting next month," Sonia continued, lifting her glass, "I'll be moving into Holly's place for a while, until things stabilize." It was clear from their faces this wasn't a suggestion. It was a plan they'd all already agreed on, and they expected me to bless it, and maybe feel honored they trusted me with their golden child. For a second, I considered playing dumb and asking a lot of questions, but the manila envelope in my purse suddenly felt like it weighed 10 pounds. The strange calm people talk about in emergencies spread through my chest. "That's quite a plan," I said, setting down my fork. "There's just one problem with it." My mom's smile faltered. "What problem?" "Honey," I reached into my bag, pulled out the closing packet, and laid it neatly on the table between the mashed potatoes and the gravy boat. "I sold the house on Friday," I said. "The Kings, my buyers, own it now. I'm renting it for a few weeks, but in about a month, I'll be gone. There's nothing for Sonia to move into." The room went very quiet. My dad picked up the papers with trembling hands, squinting at the settlement statement. My mom's hand flew to her chest like we were in a soap opera. Sonia stared at me, eyes wide, wineglass frozen midair. "You're joking," Sonia finally said, forcing out a laugh that didn't match her expression. "You heard I might need help and decided to pull some dramatic stunt." My dad shook his head slowly. "Why would you do something like this without talking to us first?" he asked, voice tight. "Selling a house is a major life decision." It would have been funny if I hadn't been so angry. "You mean the way you made major decisions about my house without talking to me first?" I asked. My mom jumped in immediately. "That's different," she said. "We were trying to help. Sonia's lease isn't being renewed. She needs a stable place. And you have all that extra space." I felt my calm starting to crack. "You keep saying I have space like it's community property," I shot back. "That extra bedroom is my home office. And even if it weren't, it's my mortgage, my repairs, my sleepless nights, none of which any of you asked about when you volunteered it to her." They didn't like that mirror being held up. My dad's voice hardened. "We have always supported both our daughters," he said. "We assumed you, of all people, would want to help your sister while she gets back on her feet." I actually laughed a short, bitter sound I didn't plan. On her feet, I repeated, "She's had more soft landings than anyone I know. You paid for her private college and let her blame everyone else when she flunked out. You covered her overdrafts, got her a car when she totaled the old one, and now you want to move her into a house I can't even afford to keep without asking me if that's possible." Sonia shoved her chair back, the legs scraping against the floor. "At least I don't act like I'm better than everyone because I bought a fixer-upper," she snapped. "You're being selfish, Holly." My mom's eyes filled with tears. "You know your sister struggles," she said. "You've always been so capable. We just thought—" She trailed off, but I knew the end of that sentence. "We thought you could carry her one more time." The conversation turned from ugly to surreal when my dad leaned his elbows on the table and asked seriously if I could get out of the sale somehow. He talked about explaining to the Kings that there was a family emergency, maybe offering them a little extra money, like I had a spare pile sitting around. My mom suggested they could help with the plumbing bill if I kept the house and let Sonia move in, as if a few $100s would somehow cover nearly $10,000 in repairs and the years of imbalance behind it. When I said no calmly, clearly, repeatedly, the guilt came out full force. Sonia admitted she had already given Ralph notice and told everyone she was moving into Over the Rhine, like she'd been promised a promotion and I'd snatched it away. My mom whispered that Sonia would be practically homeless now. I pointed out that my parents still had a guest room. My dad coughed and said that space was more like storage now, and my mom rushed to explain that Sonia needed her independence. Just apparently not enough independence to find her own lease without my house as a cushion. I left that dinner exhausted, with my mom sobbing, my dad silent, and Sonia slamming out the front door after hissing that she hoped the Kings hated my place. On the way to my car, my dad followed me and pulled me into a hug that didn't erase what just happened, but at least felt honest. "I'm proud of you," he murmured, "even if I don't get this." I drove back to my half-packed row house in silence, knowing that somewhere in that mess of mashed potatoes and manila envelopes, something permanent had shifted. Over the next week, my phone turned into a war zone. Sonia's texts swung from furious accusing me of choosing money over family and ruining her life, to manipulative reminding me of how we used to share a room, as if that erased everything between. My parents alternated long voicemails about family loyalty with increasingly detailed proposals, where I would co-sign an apartment, lend Sonia a few months' rent from my sale proceeds, or find a bigger place so she could temporarily live with me. I responded to almost none of it, except for one message where I said plainly that I had sold my house for financial reasons, and that Sonia's housing crisis was not mine to solve. Extended family joined the chorus. My Aunt Gloria called to tell me she was disappointed in my lack of family spirit and reminded me that her son, my cousin Marco, had let his brother stay in his basement for a year. Marco wrote a long email about how that year had brought them closer than ever, carefully ignoring the part where his brother had chipped in rent, and they'd actually talked about it beforehand. Every story they offered me featured voluntary sacrifice and mutual respect. None of them resembled what my parents had tried to do over pot roast. In the meantime, I was busy making the move I had already committed to. With Jade's help, I signed a lease on a one-bedroom loft in a converted warehouse just outside downtown, with polished concrete floors, big industrial windows, and a building maintenance team that would handle every broken pipe from here on out. When the Kings closed and I deposited my proceeds, I paid off my credit cards, knocked down a chunk of my student loans, and stashed a real emergency fund for the first time in my life. The relief I felt checking my account without flinching was something no lecture about selfishness could touch. A few days after I signed the loft lease, Sonia texted, "We need to talk. I'm coming over." It wasn't a question, but I let it happen because as much as I resented her, I preferred to have the blow-up face-to-face instead of in paragraphs on a screen. When she arrived, she looked around my stripped-down living room with a frown, like the boxes personally offended her. "So you're really going through with this," she said, dropping onto the one remaining chair like she owned it. "You sold the house, and now you're running away to some tiny apartment." I leaned against the doorway and told her the facts. The plumbing, the furnace, the roof, the numbers Bianca had shown me. Sonia waved it off as overreacting. Then she got to the point. "Look," she said, "Mom and Dad think maybe you could at least loan me the deposit for a new place. First and last month, maybe a security deposit. I'll pay you back once I get hired somewhere decent." Once upon a time, I might have flinched and said yes to keep the peace. This time, I heard Bianca's voice in my head and my own heartbeat in my ears, and I said no. Sonia's face hardened immediately. "Must be nice," she said, "to sit on a pile of cash and act like you're above help." I told her it wasn't about being above anything. It was about the fact that every loan my parents had ever given her had turned into a gift, and that I wasn't putting myself in that position. I reminded her she had choices: roommates, cheaper neighborhoods, even my parents' so-called storage room. She shot each option down. Roommates were for kids. Cheaper areas were sketchy, and living with our parents would crush her freedom. We went in circles until she grabbed her coat and announced that if she ended up on the street, it would be on my conscience. When the door closed behind her, the silence in the row house felt heavier than any furniture the movers had carried out. But beneath the heaviness, there was something steadier too, a sense that I had drawn a line I couldn't keep erasing every time she or my parents crossed it. The next morning, my dad texted a short message that would have shocked me a month earlier. "Your mother and I have decided Sonia will stay with us in the guest room for now. We'll figure it out." For a second, I thought maybe this was the moment everything would change, that they would finally see the difference between supporting and rescuing. But old habits dug in quickly. Within a few weeks, I heard through my mom that Sonia wasn't paying the modest rent they'd agreed on because she needed time to get on her feet, that she stayed out late and slept all morning, that dishes piled in the sink while my mom tried to tiptoe around her stress. My parents helped her finance a used car so she could get to interviews, co-signing the loan when the dealership raised an eyebrow at her credit. By the time my moving truck pulled away from over the Rhine and I turned my keys over to the Kings, Sonia had turned my parents' home into the crash pad they'd claimed they couldn't offer her when I suggested it. In my new loft, life felt different in 100 small ways. I still worked long hours, still juggled difficult clients like Nicole Grant, who thought every downtown condo should come with a river view and under market price. But at the end of the day, I came home to a space I could dust in 15 minutes and a maintenance portal where I could click leak instead of Googling plumbers. With the extra breathing room in my budget, I slept better. I started going to therapy once a week, talking through not just the dinner explosion, but the whole lifetime of being the one who would be fine. My boss, Stephen Adler, noticed my renewed focus and tossed me a few higher-end listings in Hyde Park and Oakley, trusting that I would handle them without falling apart. When my phone buzzed with texts from my family, I let more and more of them sit unread, answering only practical questions and ignoring anything that sniffed of money or guilt. Consequences came for my parents and Sonia not because of cosmic justice, but because they kept making the same choices. Sonia landed an assistant job at a small marketing agency a friend had recommended, with actual potential for growth. Within months, she was bragging to my mom about how much product she was pulling for herself from promotional budgets and how she'd convinced a vendor to comp her a weekend trip for influencer outreach that never materialized. When the agency audited its accounts, Sonia became the center of multiple complaints about missing items and expenses that didn't match any campaigns. She was fired this time with a formal notation for misconduct, which did her no favors when she tried to find the next job. Meanwhile, the car loan my parents had co-signed on went delinquent, and the vehicle was repossessed. Their credit took a hit, and the small amount they'd charged on their cards to bridge Sonia's rent turned into rolling balances they never seemed to pay off. A year after that dinner, I heard through my Aunt Gloria, Not through my parents that they had met with a financial counselor because their retirement savings were thinner than they'd admitted. Between the private college loans from Sonia's first attempt, the home equity line they'd drawn on to help her start over years ago, and this latest round of bailouts, the numbers no longer worked. They ended up selling their own house in our old neighborhood, not for a windfall like mine, but to clear enough debt to avoid deeper trouble. They downsized into a cramped rental apartment on the edge of town, where Sonia still occupied the second bedroom now in her mid-30s, with a resume full of almosts. Around that time, my parents reached out again not to apologize, but to ask if I could float them some money to rebuild their savings, just until things steadied. When I said no, my mom told me I was abandoning them in their old age. My dad suggested that someday I'd regret choosing money over blood. I told them calmly that I had spent my entire life being the backup plan, and that this was the last time I would be asked to rescue anyone. After that conversation, I made a decision I never imagined making. I blocked their numbers. I sent one final email because I wanted a written record telling them I loved them, but would no longer be available for financial help, mediation with Sonia, or emotional hostage situations. I explained that I needed distance to protect the life I had built, and that this wasn't up for debate. I didn't frame it as a threat or a test. It was simply a boundary. Then I hit send, muted the family group chat, and turned my attention fully toward my own future. In the quiet that followed, there were moments when I missed the idea of family dinners, of my dad's bad puns and my mom's cooking. But when I remembered the way my name always came up, only when there was a crisis to solve, the nostalgia faded. 2 years after I signed away the over-the-Rhine row house, I stood in another living room this time, in a modest but modern two-bedroom condo in a quieter Cincinnati neighborhood, running my hand along walls that wouldn't crumble at the first touch. The place had been built recently enough that the inspection report was almost boring. No major issues, no lurking disasters. I ran the numbers with Bianca, first determined not to repeat my old mistake. With my improved savings, careful investing of the money from the first sale, and a much more realistic sense of what I actually needed, the mortgage on this condo would be comfortable with plenty left for emergencies and the life I wanted outside of work. I thought about the girl who had once tied her worth to owning the prettiest house on the street and felt a kind of protective affection for her. She had done the best she could with the script she'd been given. I was writing a new one now. Today my life is smaller on paper, no dramatic brick facade steps from the trendiest bars, but it is larger in every way that actually matters. I have friends who invite me to dinner because they like my company, not because they assume I'll pick up the check. I have a therapist who reminds me that it's not cruel to say no to people who consistently hurt you. I have quiet mornings in my own kitchen and evenings on my small balcony looking out over Cincinnati lights, knowing every bill is paid with money I earned in a life I chose. As for my parents and Sonia, I know from the occasional tidbit I can't completely avoid that they're still living together. Still struggling, still projecting blame outward instead of inward. It's sad, but it's not my responsibility to fix. If there's one thing that dinner taught me, it's that being the capable one doesn't mean being the sacrifice. Family can be the people who raised you, but it can also be the people who respect your boundaries. I chose the latter. And if you're listening to this and recognizing yourself in the younger sibling who is always expected to give up her seat at the table, I hope you remember you are allowed to walk away. Have you ever had to leave family behind to save your own life? Tell me your story in the comments, and if mine hit home for you, please like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs permission to finally say no.